So I lived in this apartment, right? It was like an old, rundown place. You know, the kind where the paint's peeling off the walls and the floorboards creak every time you move. It wasn't anything fancy, just cheap student housing. And me and my roommate, let's call him Dave, we were renting the place for like super cheap. But like we didn't care because, you know, college students, right? As long as it had a roof and some running water, we were good. So we'd been living there for, I don't know, maybe a few months. Nothing really weird had happened at first, but then things started getting, well, off. At first, it was just little things like, stuff would go missing. And I know what you're thinking, yeah, it's probably just me being forgetful, right? But no, I swear, like I'd put my keys on the counter and the next morning they'd be like on the floor by the door or something. And not just once, it kept happening with like my phone, my wallet, little things like that. So one night, Dave and I were, you know, just hanging out in the living room, watching TV or whatever, and we hear this noise coming from the kitchen. It sounded like someone was in there, moving stuff around. So I'm like, Dave, did you hear that? And he's like, yeah, what the hell is that? Now the thing is, our kitchen's tiny, right? You can see the whole thing from the living room if you just lean over the couch a bit. So we look, and there's no one there. But the weird thing is, one of the cabinet doors was open, and like, we didn't open it. I mean, I know it sounds stupid, like, ooh, spooky open cabinet, but dude, I swear we hadn't touched it. We brushed it off though, you know, just figured maybe the door was loose or something. But then, over the next few weeks, it kept happening. Stuff moving around, weird noises, sometimes in the middle of the night, like banging or tapping, and neither of us could figure out what the hell was going on. Now Dave, he's like me. He doesn't believe in ghosts or any of that, so we're both just trying to come up with like logical explanations. Maybe the building's just old, you know, old pipes or something. Maybe the wind's coming through cracks in the windows, stuff like that. But it started getting harder and harder to explain. One night, I'm lying in bed, right? It's probably like, I don't know, 2 or 3 in the morning, and I wake up because I hear this weird noise like footsteps. But it's not coming from the hallway or anything. It's like in my room. And dude, I swear, my heart just about stopped. I'm lying there under the covers just listening, and it's like someone's walking around my bed, like super slow. I didn't know what to do, so I just stayed still, hoping it would go away. After what felt like forever, the footsteps stop. But then, and this is the part that still freaks me out to this day, I felt something like someone sitting on the edge of my bed. You know that feeling when the mattress dips down? It was like that. I didn't even breathe. Man, I was so freaked out. And then after a minute or two, the pressure lifted, like whatever it was got up and left. The next morning I told Dave about it, and he's like, dude, that's messed up. But what really freaked me out was when he said he'd been hearing footsteps too, but he didn't want to say anything because he thought I'd think he was nuts. So by this point, we're both kind of freaked out, but we're still trying to like keep it together, you know? We're not the kind of guys to believe in this stuff. But then, oh man, this one night, this was the worst. It was late again, probably around midnight or so, and Dave and I were just like chilling in the living room, right? We were both pretty tired, so we weren't really talking, just watching TV. And suddenly, we hear this loud bang, like someone slammed a door. But it wasn't just any door, it was the door to the basement. Now here's the thing, our apartment didn't have a basement. At least, that's what we thought. We'd never really explored the whole building, but like, there was no door to the basement in our apartment. So we just look at each other like, did you hear that? And Dave, he's looking as freaked out as I feel, and we both get up to go check it out. We go down the hallway, and sure enough, at the end of the hall, where there used to just be like a solid wall, there's a door. A door we've never seen before. And it's slightly ajar, like someone had just walked through it. I don't know what possessed us to do it, but we went up to it, right? And I'm like, Dave, man, maybe we shouldn't. But he's like, nah, we gotta see what's down there. So he pushes the door open, and there's this staircase leading down into darkness. It smelled weird, like musty, like something had been rotting down there for years. But we're stupid, so we start going down. We're maybe halfway down the stairs when we hear this like scratching sound coming from the bottom. It's faint, but it's there, like nails on concrete or something. And at that point I'm like, nope, we're done. But Dave's still going. I didn't want to be the chicken, so I followed him. When we get to the bottom, there's this small, cramped room. It's like dirt floors and stone walls, almost like a cellar or something. And in the corner, there's this, I don't know how to explain it, but it looked like an old, rotting piece of furniture. Maybe a crib or a cot or something. And on the wall above it, there's this writing. It looked like someone had scratched it into the stone. I don't remember what it said. I don't think I wanted to. But that scratching sound, it didn't stop. It was coming from the walls. That's when we ran. We didn't stop. We didn't look back. We just bolted out of there, slammed the door shut, and dude, we didn't sleep that night. We barely spoke about it after that either. We moved out a month later. And I don't know. Maybe it was all in our heads, right? Maybe we were just tired. Maybe it was some weird old building thing. But I'll tell you this. I've never, ever gone back to that place, and I sure as hell don't plan on finding out what was making those noises. It was a few years ago, in the late autumn of 2018, when I had this strange, terrifying experience. I've never been someone who believed in the paranormal, but what happened to me that night changed my perspective forever. I don't talk about it much, mainly because people either think I'm lying or exaggerating. But I'll share it with you, because I still can't shake the feeling that maybe, just maybe, someone else has experienced something similar. It all started with a weekend trip to the countryside. My friend Mark had just bought an old farmhouse out in the middle of nowhere. He and his wife, Sarah, were planning on renovating it into a bed and breakfast, but the place needed a lot of work. You could tell from the outside, it had that faded look of a home that had been left to rot for decades. The windows were dirty, the paint peeling, and the roof sagged slightly like it was too tired to hold itself up anymore. But Mark and Sarah loved the place, claiming it had character and charm. I wasn't so sure. The house was surrounded by dense woods, the kind of forest that seems to swallow up all the light, even in broad daylight. The nearest neighbor was probably about 5 miles away, so it was quiet. Really quiet. Too quiet for my liking. When we arrived, the sun was just starting to set, casting long, eerie shadows across the property. The house looked even more intimidating in the fading light. I helped them unload the car, bringing in supplies and tools for the renovation work we were planning to start the next morning. We spent that first evening in the kitchen, huddled around the only source of heat, the ancient wood-burning stove. It was surprisingly cozy, and after a few drinks, we started telling ghost stories. You know, the kind of thing you do when you're in an old house in the middle of nowhere. Mark and Sarah laughed at the idea of the place being haunted, but I couldn't help but feel a little uneasy. There was something about the house, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. It was like the air was heavier, like you were constantly being watched. It wasn't until later that night, when we were all getting ready for bed, that things started to get weird. I was staying in one of the upstairs bedrooms, a small room with a creaky bed and a single window overlooking the woods. The window had no curtain, and even though it was pitch black outside, I felt compelled to look out every few minutes, like something was calling me to do so. The moon was bright that night, casting pale light over the trees, but there was nothing out there. Just shadows and silence. I laid down in bed, exhausted from the long drive and the unpacking. It didn't take long for me to drift off to sleep, but my sleep wasn't peaceful. I kept waking up, feeling like someone or something was in the room with me. Each time I opened my eyes, the room was empty, but that feeling of being watched never went away. Around 3 a.m., I woke up with a start. The room was freezing cold, much colder than it had been when I went to bed. I sat up, pulling the blankets around me, and that's when I heard it, the sound of footsteps coming from the hallway just outside my door. At first, I thought it was Mark or Sarah, maybe getting up to use the bathroom, but the footsteps didn't sound right. They were slow, deliberate, and heavy, like someone was pacing back and forth in front of the door. I waited, listening, my heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps continued, never stopping, never getting closer, just pacing. I called out, "Mark? Sarah?" But there was no response. The footsteps stopped for a moment, and then I heard something else. A faint whisper, barely audible, coming from behind the door. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unsettling, almost desperate. I stood up, trying to gather the courage to open the door, but before I could move, the footsteps started again, this time moving away down the hall. I waited until the sound faded completely before I finally opened the door. The hallway was empty. No one was there. I hurried downstairs, feeling a growing sense of panic. I found Mark and Sarah asleep in their room, snoring softly. They hadn't heard a thing. I considered waking them up, but decided against it. They wouldn't believe me, and I didn't want to seem like a coward. So I went back upstairs, convinced that it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But the next day, things got worse. We spent most of the morning working on the house, tearing down old wallpaper, fixing broken windows, and patching up holes in the walls. By the afternoon, we were all exhausted, so we took a break and sat down for lunch in the kitchen. That's when Sarah mentioned something odd. She said that while she was cleaning one of the back rooms, she found a door that led down to the basement. None of us had noticed it before, probably because it was hidden behind a large old wardrobe. Being curious, she opened it and found a set of steep, narrow stairs leading down into the darkness. Mark, of course, wanted to explore it right away. I wasn't so sure. Something about the idea of going into the basement of that house gave me the creeps, but Mark insisted. We grabbed some flashlights and made our way down the stairs. The basement was even colder than the rest of the house, and the air felt thick and damp. The smell of mold and decay was overwhelming. As we explored the space, it became clear that no one had been down there in years. The floor was covered in dust, and there were old, broken pieces of furniture scattered around. But there was something else too, something that made my blood run cold. In the far corner of the basement, hidden behind a pile of debris, we found a small, locked chest. The lock was rusty, and it didn't take much effort for Mark to pry it open with a crowbar. Inside the chest, we found a collection of old, faded photographs. At first, they seemed harmless, just pictures of people, probably from the early 1900s. But as we looked through them, something became clear. The people in the photographs were all staring directly into the camera with hollow, empty eyes. Their expressions were blank, lifeless, almost as if they weren't really there. But the worst part was that the last photograph in the stack was of the house, the very same house we were standing in. And in the window, just barely visible, was the faint outline of a figure standing in the shadows, watching. We all froze. None of us said a word, but we all felt it. That presence, that feeling of being watched, it was real. We put the photographs back in the chest and hurried back upstairs, but the damage was done. For the rest of the day, the atmosphere in the house was different, heavier, darker. And that night, the footsteps returned. It was supposed to be a fun weekend. A few friends and I had rented this cabin deep in the woods, a little retreat from the chaos of the city. It wasn't some fancy resort or anything, just an old rundown cabin that one of my buddies, Sam, knew about. He claimed it was the perfect spot for a getaway. Cheap and secluded. No one bothers you out there, he'd said. That was supposed to be a selling point. We arrived just before sunset, the four of us, Sam, Jake, Lily, and me. The cabin was just like Sam had described. Isolated, surrounded by dense trees, and dead silent. The kind of silence that starts to feel heavy after a while. We were unpacking and getting settled when I noticed the woods stretching endlessly around us. I had this odd feeling like we were being watched, but I shrugged it off. It was probably just the unfamiliarity of the place, right? After all, city life doesn't prepare you for the quiet of nature. By nightfall, we had a fire going, drinks in hand, and the kind of laughter that echoed through the trees. It was fun, normal. But then Lily brought up the story, the local legend. She'd been scrolling through her phone earlier, looking up facts about the area. Apparently, the cabin wasn't as abandoned as we thought. She started telling us about a woman, someone who lived nearby a long time ago, who went missing. They never found her, but people claim to have seen her wandering the woods, even decades after her disappearance. Some say she died out there, that she'd gotten lost, or maybe worse. Jake laughed it off, calling it a lame ghost story to scare tourists, but something about it stuck with me. The way Lily told it, combined with the isolation of where we were, started to make me uneasy. We brushed it off and went back to drinking. But as the night wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Every once in a while, I'd hear a rustle in the trees or see something move out of the corner of my eye. But every time I turned to look, there was nothing there. By midnight, the fire was dying down, and Lily and Sam had already headed to bed. Jake was just about to follow when I realized I'd left my phone charger in the car. The cabin didn't have electricity, so if my phone died, I'd be completely cut off. I grabbed a flashlight and told Jake I'd be back in a few minutes. The woods at night are a completely different world. The trees felt closer, the air colder. Every crunch of leaves beneath my boots made me flinch. I tried to move quickly, telling myself I was being paranoid. It was just a short walk to the car, maybe 100 feet away from the cabin. But the deeper I went into the darkness, the heavier the air felt. As I reached the car, I fumbled for my keys, cursing under my breath. That's when I heard it, this low, soft sound, like something heavy shifting in the underbrush. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. But then there it was again, closer this time. A shuffle, a dragging sound. My stomach dropped and I froze, straining to hear. The flashlight's beam danced through the trees, illuminating nothing but shadows. But then I caught something. Just for a split second, something pale, lying low to the ground, partially obscured by the foliage. My heart pounded in my chest. I couldn't explain it, but I knew I had to look. I edged closer, shining the light on the ground. There was a shape, human-like, lying there, half covered by leaves and dirt. My mind raced, refusing to believe what I was seeing. I crouched down, the smell hitting me all at once. The unmistakable stench of rot. It was a body. Her skin was pale, almost gray, and her eyes were wide open, staring blankly into the sky. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat, bile rising up. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. She was just there. Her clothes were tattered, clinging to her bony frame like they had been there for years. Her hair, matted and tangled with leaves, was a dirty brown. But what chilled me the most was the expression frozen on her face. Her mouth was open in a silent scream, eyes wide with fear. It was like she had seen something so terrifying that it followed her even in death. For a few moments, I just stood there, frozen, my mind refusing to process what I was seeing. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. Bodies don't just show up in the middle of the woods. I had to be hallucinating, right? But the smell, the awful, overwhelming stench of decay, was real. The cold, damp air felt too real. I could hear my own heartbeat thudding in my ears, faster and faster, as if trying to drown out the reality in front of me. I don't know how long I stood there, but I knew I had to do something. I had to tell the others. But as I turned to head back to the cabin, I heard it again, that dragging sound. This time, it was much closer. I whipped the flashlight around, the beam bouncing wildly off the trees, but there was nothing. Just the eerie stillness of the forest. My skin prickled, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. Something was wrong, horribly wrong. Panic surged through me. I sprinted back to the cabin, barely able to keep my footing as I tore through the undergrowth. I burst through the door, breathless, shaking, the flashlight flickering in my hand. Jake looked up from the couch, confused. "What the hell, man? You okay?" I couldn't get the words out at first. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would burst out of my chest. There's a body out there in the woods. Jake stared at me, not moving, not saying a word. Then he laughed, but it wasn't a confident laugh. "You're messing with me, right?" I shook my head, my voice trembling. "No, I'm serious. You have to come see. We have to call someone." Reluctantly, Jake stood up, grabbing his jacket. He still didn't believe me. I could tell by the way he rolled his eyes. But I wasn't crazy. I wasn't making it up. I led him outside, the air colder than before, the night pressing in on us from every side. The flashlight flickered again, casting long, jagged shadows across the path. As we got closer to the spot where I had seen her, I could feel my stomach knotting. The stench was back, stronger this time. I knew we were close, but when we reached the spot, the body was gone. Jake turned to me, eyebrows raised. "So, where is it?" I frantically searched the ground, the underbrush. The leaves were disturbed, the dirt uneven where the body had been, but she wasn't there anymore. "I swear to God, Jake, she was right here." My voice came out louder than I intended, on the verge of hysteria. "Look," Jake said, trying to calm me down. "You've had a long day. Maybe you saw something else. A pile of leaves, a shadow. Hell, maybe you've had too much to drink." "No," I said, shaking my head. It was real. She was real. We both stood there in silence, the darkness around us feeling suddenly too close, too oppressive. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Jake put a hand on my shoulder, but before he could say anything, we heard it. That same dragging sound. Slow, deliberate. It was closer than before. This time, Jake heard it too. His hand tightened on my shoulder, and I saw his face pale. The sound seemed to be circling us, moving just beyond the reach of the flashlight. My mouth went dry, my heart pounding in my chest. I felt exposed, vulnerable, like whatever was out there was watching us, playing with us. "Let's get back to the cabin," Jake whispered, his voice barely audible. We didn't wait. We turned and ran, not looking back, not daring to see what might be following us. As soon as we were inside, Jake slammed the door shut, locking it, his hands shaking. "What the hell was that?" he asked, his voice tight with fear. For the first time, I saw the same terror in his eyes that I felt in the pit of my stomach. "I don't know," I admitted, "but we need to leave. Now." We woke Lily and Sam, who were groggy and confused at first, but after seeing the look on our faces, they didn't ask many questions. We packed up whatever we could in a hurry, throwing our bags into the car and getting out of there as fast as possible. The whole time, I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see that pale figure watching us from the trees. We never did call the police. None of us wanted to talk about what happened that night. We drove back to the city in silence, the weight of what I had seen, or thought I had seen, hanging heavy in the air. So let me start by saying that I deliver packages for a living. Nothing fancy, just a regular delivery guy. I've done this for years, and I thought I had seen it all. But then came this one delivery that changed everything. It was a chilly October evening when I was assigned a delivery to a house out in the woods. It wasn't an unusual request, but it was a bit off the beaten path. The address was on a long, winding road that was barely wide enough for my truck. I remember thinking it was kind of spooky out there, with the tall trees leaning in like they were trying to swallow the road. But I shrugged it off. I mean, it was just another delivery, right? When I finally reached the house, I noticed it was old, like really old. It had this weird, dilapidated charm to it, like something straight out of a horror movie. The paint was peeling, the shutters were hanging askew, and there was a rickety old porch that looked like it was about to fall apart. The only light came from a single bulb hanging from a wire, swinging gently in the breeze. It gave off a flickering glow that made the shadows dance around in eerie patterns. I grabbed the package from the back of my truck. It was a fairly large box, wrapped in plain brown paper, with no return address or anything on it. Just a name, the address. I walked up the creaky steps to the front door, which was slightly ajar. I knocked, but no one answered. I knocked again, a bit louder this time, and still no response. I pushed the door open just a crack and peeked inside. The place was dark, and I could barely make out the outline of furniture through the gloom. I called out, "Delivery," but got no reply. I stepped inside and the door creaked loudly behind me. The air was musty, like it hadn't been opened in years. I could see dust motes floating in the faint light. I set the package down on a small table near the door and was about to turn to leave when I heard a faint noise coming from the back of the house. It was a soft, shuffling sound, like someone dragging their feet across the floor. I froze, listening intently. The sound stopped, and for a moment, there was only silence. I took a deep breath and decided to call out again, just in case. "Hello? Is anyone here?" I said, trying to sound casual, but my voice wavered a little. There was no answer. I turned to leave, but then I noticed something strange. The package I had just set down seemed to have moved. It was now slightly off-center from where I had placed it. I shook my head, thinking maybe I'd nudged it when I was setting it down. I went to adjust it, but then I heard that shuffling sound again, this time closer. My heart started pounding. I looked around the dark room, trying to find the source of the noise. That's when I saw it, a shadowy figure standing at the end of the hallway, just beyond the reach of the dim light. It was tall and thin, and it was just standing there, staring at me. I couldn't make out any details, just a dark shape against the darkness. I didn't wait to find out more. I grabbed the package and bolted for the door. As I reached the porch, I heard the shuffling sound again, this time right behind me. I practically threw myself into the truck and slammed the door shut, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. I glanced back at the house, but the figure was gone. I drove away quickly, my mind racing. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. Maybe I was just tired or spooked by the creepy house. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something had been watching me. So after that night, I thought I'd never have to go back to that house. But of course, that's not how things work in my line of work. A week later, I got another delivery to the same address. I couldn't believe it. My boss told me it was a special request and needed to be delivered personally. I tried to explain what happened before, but he just brushed it off, saying it was probably nothing and I shouldn't let it bother me. Reluctantly, I made my way back to that house. The drive was just as unsettling as the first time. The trees seemed to be closing in on the road, and the shadows looked even darker. When I pulled up to the house, it looked just as creepy as before. The porch light was still flickering, and the place was still shrouded in darkness. This time, I wasn't about to just walk in. I knocked on the door again, and after a few moments, I heard a faint shuffling sound from inside. My heart sank. I called out, "Delivery, I've got a package for you." But there was no response. I waited for what felt like an eternity, but no one came. I decided to leave the package on the porch, hoping someone would find it. As I turned to leave, I heard the shuffling sound again, this time coming from right behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing there. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I moved quickly, trying to get back to my truck as fast as possible. But just as I was about to reach the driver's door, I felt a cold hand grip my shoulder. I nearly jumped out of my skin and spun around, but there was no one there. I got into the truck and locked the doors, my mind racing. I glanced back at the house one last time, and that's when I saw it. The shadowy figure was standing in the window, just like before, but this time it was closer. It was as if it had been following me. I drove away, my hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Every time I glanced in the rearview mirror, I half expected to see that dark shape behind me. When I finally got home, I was a mess. I didn't sleep well that night, and I kept hearing strange noises. I never did find out who or what that figure was. I tried to ask around, but no one seemed to know anything about the house or its occupants. The next time I had to deliver to that address, it was as if everything had changed. The house was empty, and the address didn't even exist anymore. It was like it had been erased from existence. Even now, I still get chills thinking about that place. I don't know what I saw or why it happened, but I do know one thing. Some places are better left undisturbed. And if you ever find yourself in a situation like mine, just remember, it's better to drive away than to stick around and find out what's really lurking in the dark. So, last Halloween, I decided to take a little trip to my grandma's old house. You know, the one that's been abandoned for years. I wasn't sure why, but I just had this weird urge to check it out. Anyway, I got there just as the sun was setting. The place looked even creepier than I remembered, with all the windows boarded up and the paint peeling off. I went inside, and man, it was like walking into a time capsule. Everything was covered in dust, and there was this musty smell. I started exploring the rooms, and I found this old rocking chair in the corner of the living room. It looked like something straight out of a horror movie. Anyway, I thought it'd be cool to snap a few pictures. So, I'm taking photos, and I keep hearing these strange creaks and groans from upstairs. I figured it was just the house settling or whatever, so I ignored it. But then I saw this shadow moving in the corner of my eye. I turned around, and the rocking chair was moving by itself. I swear, it was moving back and forth like someone was sitting in it. I was freaked out, but tried to convince myself it was just my imagination. I decided to head upstairs, and as I was walking up the stairs, I heard this whispering sound. It was like someone was right behind me. But when I turned around, there was nothing there. My heart was racing, and I felt like I was being watched. I finally made it to the top, and there was this old, dusty mirror in one of the bedrooms. When I looked in it, I swear I saw a figure standing behind me. I turned around, but there was nothing there. I decided it was time to leave, so I made my way back downstairs, and that's when I heard a door slam shut behind me. I didn't even look back. I just ran out of there as fast as I could. To this day, I don't know what I saw or heard in that house, but every time Halloween rolls around, I can't help but think about that night and the feeling of something or someone watching me from the shadows. I think a Thursday, and I was working late at the office. You know, those days when you just need to finish that one last report and time just slips away. So there I was, typing away in my cubicle, and by the time I looked up, it was almost midnight. Anyway, the office building I work in is one of those old brick buildings that have seen better days. It's got that classic creepy vibe, you know? The kind where the lights flicker sometimes, and the air conditioning makes weird noises. Yeah, that kind of place. So, I'm gathering my things, and I decide to head out. I get to the elevator, and that's when things started to get weird. I pressed the button for the elevator, and it took a while to come. I was kind of annoyed because, well, it's already late, and I just want to go home. So I'm standing there, and I notice something strange. The elevator's indicator light above the door was flickering. Not just a regular flicker, but like a really erratic one, like on-off, you know? So finally, the elevator arrives. I step inside, and it's, the kind of elevator that's got that old metal grate for a door that you have to slide open. It's a bit grimy, but it works. I press the button for the lobby, and the doors close. I can hear the old gears groaning as it starts to move. Now, as the elevator's going down, I start to feel a bit uneasy. It's not just the flickering light or the strange noises. It's more like an eerie feeling that something's off. I try to shake it off and pull out my phone to distract myself, but then I notice something even stranger. The elevator's moving slower than usual, like really slow. I look up, and the indicator shows that we're on the 9th floor, but we're not moving at all. I press the button for the lobby again, and nothing happens. I start to get a bit anxious, but, I mean, it's just an old elevator, right? These things break down sometimes. I try to stay calm and wait, but after a few more minutes, I notice that the light above the door has stopped flickering. It's just off now. Complete darkness. I'm starting to get really nervous at this point. I press the emergency button, but all I get is a crackly, empty response. I start to feel this cold sweat on my back. It's so quiet in the elevator, like the kind of quiet where you start hearing your own heartbeat. I'm trying to think of ways to get out, and that's when I hear it. A faint, almost imperceptible scratching sound. It's coming from above the elevator. I look up, and I can see a small panel in the ceiling of the elevator shaft. The scratching gets louder, and it's like something is trying to get through. My heart is racing, and I'm sweating buckets. I try to stay calm, but the scratching is really freaking me out. I start banging on the doors and yelling for help, but no one's around. After what feels like forever, the elevator jerks suddenly and starts moving again. It's going faster now, and I'm relieved, but I can't shake the feeling that something's wrong. The elevator finally reaches the lobby, and the doors open with a groan. I practically tumble out of the elevator and look back, but, there's nothing there. No sign of anything unusual. I quickly leave the building and call a cab. I'm not sticking around to find out what that scratching was. The next day, I tried to ask the building maintenance about it, but they just brushed me off, saying it was probably just the old elevator gears acting up. They acted like it was nothing, but I'm not so sure. To this day, I avoid taking the elevator if I can help it. And whenever I see that flickering light or hear that groaning noise, I can't help but think about what was crawling around in that elevator shaft. So, yeah, that's my story. I know it sounds kind of crazy, but I swear it happened. Maybe next time just take the stairs, okay? The house stood on the outskirts of a forgotten town in New England, its silhouette etched sharply against the pale light of the crescent moon. Ivy crawled across the crumbling walls, gripping the stones like an old, forgotten memory, refusing to let go. For years, the house had been left abandoned, its windows boarded, its doors locked, and the townspeople whispered tales of strange happenings within. No one dared to approach, except for David. David was a man who had always been drawn to the edges of fear, fascinated by the darkness that lay beneath the surface of the world. A writer by trade, he thrived on the obscure, the grotesque, and the hidden nightmares of the human mind. He had heard of this house, not through a friend or the usual urban legends, but through a dream, a recurring vision that invaded his sleep, pulling him closer each time until he could no longer resist. The dream always started the same way. David standing at the base of the hill, gazing up at the house. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying faint voices, like someone calling his name. The house would beckon to him, and he would climb the hill, step by step, feeling an unseen force drawing him in. But he would always wake before entering the front door. Tonight, however, was different. Tonight, David wasn't dreaming. The evening air was thick, pregnant with the smell of decaying wood and damp earth. The road leading to the house was overgrown with weeds and twisted roots, as if nature itself was trying to hide the place from view. David's heart thudded in his chest as he stepped through the rusted iron gate, which groaned as if it hadn't been opened in years. His flashlight flickered, the beam cutting through the suffocating darkness. As he approached the front door, the air grew colder. He hesitated for a moment, feeling the weight of an unseen gaze upon him, but the pull of the house was stronger than his fear. He reached for the handle. To his surprise, the door creaked open easily, as if it had been waiting for him all along. Inside, the house was a cavern of shadows. The hallway stretched endlessly, lined with peeling wallpaper and portraits of faces he didn't recognize, yet somehow felt disturbingly familiar. The faces in the portraits seemed to shift when he wasn't looking directly at them, their eyes following his every movement. His breathing grew shallow, and his footsteps echoed unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence. There was something wrong about the house. It wasn't just the decay or the darkness. It was as if the walls themselves were alive, watching, listening. David felt it in his bones, the sense that he wasn't alone. But there was no one here, only him. And the shadows. David explored the lower floor first. The living room was filled with dust-covered furniture, the kind that belonged in another era. Old magazines lay strewn on a coffee table, their pages yellowed and brittle. In the kitchen, dishes sat in the sink, as if someone had just left them there, frozen in time. It was as if the house had been abandoned in the middle of life, but for what reason he couldn't tell. Then came the first sound. A faint whisper, barely audible, drifting through the air like a breeze. David froze, his heart pounding in his ears. He turned slowly, shining his flashlight in the direction of the noise. Nothing, just the empty hallway behind him. But the whisper continued, growing louder, almost beckoning him forward. David. The sound of his name spoken in a low, raspy voice sent a chill down his spine. He turned the flashlight toward the staircase at the end of the hall. The whisper seemed to come from upstairs. His pulse quickened. Part of him wanted to run, to leave the house and never come back. But the other part, the part that was drawn to the unknown, urged him to go further. He began climbing the stairs, each step creaking under his weight. The air grew heavier, thick with the scent of mildew and something else, something sour, like rotten meat. The whisper grew louder, echoing through the narrow stairwell. At the top of the stairs, the hallway stretched out before him, lined with closed doors. The whisper seemed to come from behind one of them, the door at the very end of the hall. David's hands trembled as he reached for the handle. The door opened with a soft groan, revealing a room cloaked in shadow. The beam of his flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the figure of a woman standing in the corner, her back turned toward him. She was still, unnaturally still, her long, dark hair hanging over her face. David's heart leapt into his throat. He tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. Who are you?" he managed to whisper, his voice trembling. The woman didn't respond. She stood motionless, her shoulders barely rising and falling, as if she were breathing. David took a cautious step forward, his instincts screaming for him to run, but something kept him there. There was something familiar about her, a strange, twisted recognition that he couldn't shake. As he stepped closer, his flashlight flickered, and for a split second, the woman's face flashed before him. Pale, hollow eyes, lips twisted into a grotesque smile. David gasped, stumbling backward, but when the light stabilized, she was gone. The room was empty. A cold sweat broke out on his forehead. He backed out of the room, slamming the door shut behind him, his heart racing. What was that? Was he seeing things? The house seemed to pulse with a life of its own, its walls closing in around him, suffocating him with an overwhelming sense of dread. Just as he was about to turn and flee, something on the floor caught his eye. A photograph, old and worn, lying in the dust near his feet. He picked it up, his hands shaking. It was a picture of a family standing in front of the very house he was in. A man, a woman, and a little boy. David stared at the faces in the photograph, his blood running cold. The man in the photograph was him. His vision blurred, and for a moment the hallway seemed to twist and bend, the walls warping like they were made of liquid. He stumbled backward, his mind reeling. The whisper returned, louder now, filling his head with voices, echoes of a life he couldn't remember but was somehow his own. David dropped the photograph, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He had to get out. He had to leave before the house consumed him. But the whisper was relentless, drawing him deeper into the labyrinth of his own mind, where reality and nightmare blurred into one. The night had only just begun. David stumbled down the stairs, his mind spinning, unable to shake the vision of the woman or the photograph. The walls of the house seemed to pulse with an almost organic rhythm, as though the very structure was alive, breathing in sync with his panicked heart. The air around him thickened, suffocating, and the faint whispers from earlier seemed to grow louder, more insistent. The door. He needed to get out. He could still hear his own footsteps echoing down the long hallway behind him, though something about them felt off. Too slow, too delayed, like they didn't belong to him. David turned, casting his flashlight back toward the staircase. But as the light swept across the house's rotting interior, the hall behind him seemed to stretch impossibly far, elongating like a surreal nightmare. There was no door. The front door, the way he had come in, was gone. His breath caught in his throat as panic surged through him. He spun around, trying to make sense of the space, but the house seemed to be playing tricks on him. The corridor looped in on itself, curving at impossible angles, leading him back to places he swore he'd just left. Every door he tried was locked or led to an empty room, and the longer he wandered, the more the walls seemed to close in, trapping him in a suffocating web of shadow and silence. "David?" The voice whispered again, closer now. It seemed to come from every direction, weaving in and out of the darkness. It wasn't a mere voice. It was many voices, layered over each other, all speaking him with a tone that tarried an unsettling familiarity. He pushed through the fog in his mind, trying to regain control, but the more he fought, the deeper he sank into confusion. "Focus. You're hallucinating. It's the house. It's playing tricks on you." David repeated these words to himself, but they rang hollow. Something far more insidious was happening here. The walls, the floors, the very fabric of the house seemed to warp around him, as if the place was bending reality to its will. He reached another door, this one slightly ajar. With a trembling hand, he pushed it open, revealing what appeared to be a study. A single desk sat in the middle of the room, its surface cluttered with papers and old photographs. The window, shrouded in grime, let in only a sliver of moonlight. A heavy, musty smell filled the room, mingled with something sharp, like antiseptic. David stepped inside cautiously, his eyes scanning the room. He walked toward the desk, the floor creaking ominously beneath him. Among the papers scattered on the desk, one caught his attention. It was a journal, its pages yellowed with age. The cover bore a name, written in elegant, looping script. Jonathan Hargrove. The name meant nothing to him, but as he opened the journal, a strange sense of déjà vu washed over him. The entries were written in neat handwriting, detailing the life of a man who once lived in the house. Jonathan Hargrove had been the owner, an enigmatic figure who had moved to the house with his family years ago. The journal spoke of his fascination with dreams and the unconscious mind, of his obsession with finding a way to communicate with the world beyond sleep. The later entries grew more frantic, the handwriting becoming jagged, unstable. The dreams, they're not just dreams. They're windows, glimpses into something darker, something ancient. I see her now. Even when I'm awake, she's everywhere. She watches, she waits. But it's not just her. There are others, whispers in the walls. They know my name. They know my past. David felt a shiver run down his spine. The description in the journal echoed his own experiences. Dreams bleeding into reality. Whispers that seemed to come from the very walls. But who was she? His eyes moved to the photograph tucked into the journal. It was old, faded, showing a woman standing in the yard of the house, her face half obscured by shadows. Her figure was disturbingly familiar, tall, with long dark hair falling over her shoulders. The same woman he had seen upstairs. As David stared at the photograph, the whispers grew louder again, swelling like a tide inside his mind. The woman's face twisted in his memory, her hollow eyes staring straight into his soul. He clenched his fists, trying to steady his breathing, but the room seemed to close in around him. The walls began to pulse, bending and warping, and a sickening nausea crept over him as reality slipped further out of reach. Suddenly, a sharp pain shot through his head, as though something was clawing its way into his skull. He fell to his knees, clutching his temples as flashes of images flooded his mind, fragments of memories that weren't his own. He saw himself standing in the yard of the house, but it wasn't the house as it was now. It was pristine, beautiful, alive with the laughter of a child. He saw the woman, her face gentle and kind, but then it twisted into something monstrous. Her eyes empty, her smile grotesque. The pain intensified. His vision blurred, and the room around him twisted and melted, shifting between the present and some fractured past. David screamed, the sound echoing through the house like a distant wail. He was no longer in control of his body. Some force was inside him, trying to tear him apart from the inside out. As the pain reached its peak, the room snapped back into focus, and David collapsed, gasping for breath. He was back in the study, but everything felt wrong. His body felt heavier, like he was sinking into the floor. The whispers had stopped, but the silence was worse, thick, oppressive, as though the house was holding its breath. Struggling to his feet, David glanced around, his vision still swimming. The photograph on the desk was gone, and the journal lay open to a final, incomplete entry, scrawled in frantic handwriting. She's here. She's always been here. And now I understand. This house, it's not haunted. It's alive. It feeds on us, on our memories, our fears. She's its heart, its soul. But there's more. There's something beneath, something older, waiting in the dark. David backed away from the desk, his pulse racing. The woman, whoever she was, wasn't just a ghost. She was something far worse, a presence tied to the house itself. And now he was trapped here, in her web. A soft creaking sound came from the hallway. David turned toward the door, dread pooling in his stomach. There, standing in the doorway, was the woman. Her head tilted slightly, her hollow eyes fixed on him, her lips curled into that same grotesque smile. David's flashlight flickered and went out. The last thing he heard before the darkness consumed him was the sound of her voice, soft and cruel, whispering his name. David awoke in darkness. His body felt heavy, as if the weight of the house had settled onto him and pinning him to the floor. The air was thick and damp, carrying the faint stench of rot. He blinked, trying to focus, but there was no light, only an endless, suffocating blackness. His mind raced, scrambling to make sense of where he was. He could no longer feel the cold, hard floor beneath him. Instead, it was as if he was floating in a void, detached from his body. His thoughts were fragmented, disjointed. Was any of this real? The house, the whispers, the woman, they all seemed to blur together, tangled in a web of nightmares that he couldn't escape. He reached out, his fingers searching for something solid, but all he found was empty air. The whispering returned. David? The voice was soft, almost tender, but it was laced with something sinister. something that chilled him to his core. It was closer now, circling him, as though it were inside his very mind. He tried to move, but his body wouldn't respond. Panic surged through him as he realized he was paralyzed, trapped within his own mind, unable to wake up or escape. And then the voice came again, this time in a slow, mocking tone. "Do you remember?" Images flashed before his eyes, visions of the house, but different. He saw it as it had once been, vibrant and alive, filled with warmth and light. A family lived here, happy, unaware of the darkness that lurked just beneath the surface. He saw the man from the photograph, Jonathan Hargrove, and his wife, the woman with the hollow eyes. They were smiling, but their smiles never reached their eyes. There was something wrong in those images, a tension simmering beneath the surface, like a festering wound waiting to burst open. David's vision twisted again, warping like a film reel caught in a projector. He saw himself, standing in the front yard of the house, but this time he wasn't an outsider. He was part of it, tied to the family. The boy in the photograph, their son, he was that boy. Memories flooded his mind, painful and disorienting, as if pieces of his past had been ripped away and then forcibly returned. This house is my home, but I've forgotten it. As that realization sank in, the void around him began to shift. The floor solidified beneath his feet, and the oppressive darkness gave way to a dim, flickering light. He found himself standing at the foot of the stairs again, staring up into the same endless corridor. The walls were cracked and peeling, the air thick with decay. But something was different now. Something had shifted inside him. The house was no longer just an old, forgotten structure. It was alive, and it had been waiting for him all along. The whispers intensified, swirling around him in a cacophony of voices, but now they carried more than just malice. There was recognition, a twisted sense of familiarity. He wasn't just a visitor here. He had been part of this house once, a long time ago, before everything had gone wrong. And the woman, she wasn't just a ghost haunting the house. She was his mother. David's knees buckled as the truth hit him like a wave. Memories that had been buried deep within him resurfaced, each one more painful than the last. He remembered her, his mother, beautiful and kind in the beginning, but over time, her mind had fractured. She had fallen into obsession, delving into forbidden things, her sanity unraveling as she sought to commune with something far beyond human understanding. His father, Jonathan Hargrove, had tried to stop her, but it was too late. The house had already taken her, and it had taken David too. The house had consumed them, twisting their memories and their lives, trapping them in an endless cycle of suffering and madness. His mother had become part of the house, her presence forever entwined with its dark heart, feeding on the fear and despair of those who dared to enter. David staggered to his feet, his pulse racing as the walls around him seemed to ripple and shift, as though the house was responding to his thoughts. He had to get out. He had to break free of this nightmare before the house claimed him completely. But as he turned to flee, the hallway stretched out impossibly before him, elongating like a living thing, taunting him with its endless length. The door at the end of the hall, the front door, was just a sliver of light, impossibly far away. "David," the voice came again, closer now. His mother's voice, but it was no longer soft or tender. It was cold, filled with a malevolent hunger. "You can't leave. You belong here, with me." He stumbled back, the walls closing in on him. The air grew thick and his vision blurred as the house seemed to breathe, its pulse quickening, feeding on his fear. He tried to move, but his legs felt like they were made of lead, each step harder than the last. And then she appeared, his mother, standing at the top of the stairs, her hollow eyes fixed on him, her face twisted into a grotesque parody of a smile. Her arms reached out toward him, beckoning him to come closer. "Stay with me, David. Don't you see? This is where you belong. This house is our home. It's always been." David's heart pounded in his chest as he backed away, but the hallway seemed to twist and warp around him, distorting reality itself. There was no escape. The house had become a maze, its architecture shifting and bending to keep him trapped inside. His mother stepped closer, her figure dissolving into shadow and then reforming, like smoke. "You can't leave, David. You've always been part of this. You've always been mine." With a surge of desperation, David turned and ran, his legs burning as he pushed himself toward the distant door. The walls groaned, the house screaming in protest, but he kept moving, forcing himself forward. The whispers chased him, their voices growing louder, more frantic. David. His mother's voice shrieked from somewhere behind him, closer now, filled with fury. You can't leave, you can't escape me. The door was just ahead, the sliver of light growing brighter, but the hallway seemed to stretch on forever. David's breath came in ragged gasps, his body aching as if the house itself was draining the life out of him. He reached out, his fingers brushing the door handle, and in that moment, everything stopped. The whispers ceased. The air became still. And for the first time since he had entered the house, there was silence. But it was too late. David looked down, his heart sinking as he realized that his hand had passed through the door. His body was no longer solid, no longer real. He had become part of the house. The light at the end of the hall flickered once, twice, and then vanished, leaving him in total darkness. His mother's voice came one last time, a soft, mocking whisper in the void. Welcome home, David. And with that, the house consumed him completely. It was a couple of years ago. I had this thing like a conference or something. It was in this small town I had never really been to before. I don't even remember the name of it now, but it wasn't a big deal, just a few hours away from where I lived. Anyway, I decided to drive myself there, mostly because I thought it would be nice to get out of the city for a bit. You know, clear my head, take a little road trip, that sort of thing. So I got done with the conference thing, and I was heading back. It was later than I planned, like I hadn't realized the thing would go on for so long. And by the time I was on the road, it was already getting dark. And it wasn't like there were many streetlights or anything. It was one of those rural roads, kind of winding, with trees on both sides. Honestly, the kind of road that's kind of peaceful during the day, but at night, yeah, a little creepy. I remember my GPS telling me there was like a quicker route, some shortcut through an even smaller road. I figured, why not? It would shave off some time, and I just wanted to get home. So I turned off the main road, and, well, that's when things started feeling weird. This road, it wasn't in great shape. It was narrow, the pavement was all cracked, and there were barely any cars around. Actually, I don't think I saw any other cars at all once I got on it. Just me, the trees, and this road that seemed to go on forever. After a while, I kind of started regretting taking the shortcut. You know that feeling when you're just sure you made the wrong choice, but it's too late to turn back? Yeah, that. Anyway, I'm driving along, and all of a sudden my headlights catch something up ahead on the side of the road. It's hard to describe. At first I thought it was maybe an animal or some debris, like just something that had fallen into the road. But as I got closer, I realized there was a person there. A man. He was standing there, kind of bent over, doing something near the ditch. Like I couldn't see exactly what he was doing at first, because it was dark, and I didn't want to stop or slow down too much. I just remember thinking, what's this guy doing out here in the middle of nowhere at night? I figured maybe his car had broken down or something, and he was trying to fix it. You know, that seemed logical. So I didn't think too much of it, and just kept driving, even though, I don't know. Something about the whole thing made me feel uneasy. As I passed him, though, I got a better look. And, man, I wish I hadn't. I could see he wasn't near a car at all. There was no vehicle, no tools, nothing that made sense for someone to be out there. He was dragging something. Something big. At first I thought, is that a bag? A duffel bag or something? It was large, long, and it looked heavy, like it was taking a lot of effort for him to pull it. But it wasn't just a bag. I could see, well, I couldn't tell right away, but there was something about the shape. It didn't sit right with me. I wanted to convince myself that maybe it was like some old furniture or something, but deep down, I knew that wasn't it. I kept driving, trying to push the image out of my head, but my heart was racing. I kept thinking, what if that wasn't just a bag? What if it was something else? But I didn't stop. I didn't want to go back and check. And I sure as hell didn't want to get out of the car. So I just kept driving. My hands were gripping the steering wheel so tight, and I could feel this, I don't know, this sinking feeling in my stomach, like I had just seen something I wasn't supposed to. After what felt like forever, I finally saw some lights up ahead. It was like this little gas station, kind of run down but still open. I pulled in, mostly because I needed a break and my head was spinning. I thought about going in to get a drink, but instead I just sat in my car for a few minutes, trying to calm down. That's when I noticed something. My hands were shaking, like really shaking, and my mind kept going back to that guy and whatever it was he was dragging. I started thinking, what if it was a body? What if I just saw something horrible and I just drove away? I don't know what made me do it, but I ended up going inside the gas station and talking to the guy behind the counter. He was this older guy, probably in his 60s, and he didn't seem all that interested in conversation, but I asked him if he knew anything about the road I had just been on. You know, if it was a common shortcut or if there were any accidents recently or anything. The guy gave me this weird look, like I was asking something really strange, and he said, "Not much happens on that road. Folks around here don't take it at night, though." I asked him why not, and he just kind of shrugged and said, "People say it's haunted or something like that. Bad things have happened out there over the years." I laughed, but it came out kind of forced. Haunted? That's ridiculous, right? But I couldn't shake the feeling that what I saw wasn't just some random guy dragging a bag. I don't know. Maybe it was the way the guy in the gas station said it, but I couldn't get it out of my head. I drove home after that, but the whole way, I kept checking my rearview mirror, like I was expecting to see something or someone following me. I didn't see anything, but I never took that shortcut again. Here's the thing. I never reported it. I didn't even tell anyone about it for a long time because, well, I didn't want people to think I was crazy. But sometimes, late at night when I'm trying to fall asleep, I think about that man and what he was dragging into the woods. I keep wondering if it really was a body, and if it was, who it belonged to. And if I had just driven by someone who was, getting rid of evidence.